Welcome everybody to this hangout in which we are anticipating tomorrow's politics, looking particularly at the case for anarchist transhumanism. And we've got a number of panelists who are going to be introduced shortly. My name is David Wood. I'm the executive of Transpolitica. Let me briefly share a couple of slides where you can see the panelists who are going to be introduced. Transpolitica is about anticipating tomorrow's politics in the sense of envisioning the positive qualities and characteristics of future social structures that we have reason to think might be around the corner, and then taking steps to achieving and bringing forward and making a reality quicker, if possible, of these desirable qualities and characteristics. But at the same time, being aware of some of the negative characteristics that might be in future social structures. And we can look ahead and see these undesirable scenarios. And so we'll take steps to discuss these and figure out how to avoid them. So that's the broad picture of Transpolitica, this think tank. Now, when we discuss tomorrow's politics, two words that crop up quite often are transhumanism and anarchism. In a moment, you'll hear from each of the panelists what these words mean to them. To me, transhumanism is about the positive transformation of humanity via technology. No longer should humanity just be evolving because of evolution, but we can take advantage of technology wisely to intelligently redesign ourselves at the individual level, but also at the social level. Anarchism means no rulers. It means there's no centralized state apparatus. It means there are still rules, there are still standards, but they are collaboratively decided and collaboratively administered for the benefits of everybody. But bringing these two words together isn't something that happens that often, anarchist transhumanism. But the possibility is for technology to allow decentralization to happen in a way that maybe historically has not been possible. So that's what our panelists will each be talking about. And so, having said that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists one by one to introduce themselves and to start by answering the question, what does transhumanism mean to them? And I'd like to go first to Summerspeaker.
Hello. So I'm Summer. I'm a PhD student in American Studies at the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And to me, transhumanism is about transcending current limitations, about really the ability to create ourselves, to make of ourselves what we want, without both at the individual level, like David Wood said, and collectively. And I do identify as a transhumanist, both because of my engagement with, I guess you could say, the mainstream or standard transhumanist texts, but also the utopian tradition within anarchism and various brands of socialism. And I blog about transhumanism at Queering the Singularity.
Queering the Singularity.
Yeah, queersingularity.wordpress.com.
Good. Thanks, Summer. So we'll come back to you shortly on anarchism. Let's move to Stockholm, to Waldemar Ingdhahl. Now, Waldemar, you have a history as being the president, as I understand, from quite a long time ago, of the Swedish Transhumanist Association. So I'm guessing you will positively identify as a transhumanist. What does transhumanism mean to you?
Transhumanism, for me, is to be able to take advantage of new technologies and the opportunity to use these technologies for the betterment of society, and also to be able to break the boundaries of what has been considered human previously. And I think it's interesting to study, of course, how genetics, robotics, informatics, and neurotechnologies, nanotechnologies converge into something new, something radically new. And studying those things, of course, gives you a lot of thoughts about what future society will look like and should look like.
So in view of all these technologies, it's not just going to be a simple change from what we've had in the past. It's not like we discover a new element or we figure out how to drive a little bit faster on our cars. The changes that's coming is much more fundamental than that.
Oh, we've seen fundamental changes previously in history, just that they took quite a relatively long time, a couple of 100 years. Perhaps we're now down to decades into the normal lifespan of this age. So it becomes much more crucial to address these issues politically and philosophically.
Great. Let's move to Kris Notaro. And Kris is actually sharing his screen, as you can see, with Dan Fisher. And the two of them are combining their intellects through one video channel and give them both a chance for them to answer the same question. So introduce yourselves and say, what's your connection to transhumanism? Kris.
Hi, my name's Kris Notaro, and I'm the Managing Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. I am going to apply for grad school, for philosophy of mind. But transhumanism means to me a new paradigm shift within science, technology, and philosophy. And this paradigm shift is basically the inevitability of humans, human intellectualism and intelligence being able to manipulate themselves and the environment. And it was inevitable from the start when we started science and philosophy that we would understand DNA, eventually brain-to-computer interfaces, and rejuvenation technology. So transhumanism to me is all about, it's not about being gods. I think that's a misconception of transhumanism. And I think that in philosophy, we see a lot of anti-God, anti-God like rhetoric, but it's not rhetoric. I mean, it's serious stuff. It's not humans trying to become God. So,
and that's important to you because anarchism, and I said at the beginning, it means no rulers, but it also means no gods. Mm-hmm. And although some transhumanists have said, you know, we're on the point as humans of becoming godlike, you are not looking forward to some humans being gods over other humans. You're looking for an elevation of society rather than an elevation of a small number into positions of a great power over society.
Well, I think I'll talk about that later, and the connection of transhumanism to consciousness studies and how those relate, and how the self and ego relates to how we envision technology. So if I could pass it along to Dan Fisher here.
Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Fisher. I'm a member of Capitalism versus the Climate. We're an organization based in Connecticut. We take nonviolent direct action in solidarity with the communities most impacted by the global climate crisis. I'm new to the concept of transhumanism, but I'll tell you my reaction. I don't have any objection to it in principle. I'm a believer in the precautionary principle, and that means that in order to introduce and implement a new technology, I think that it's up to scientists to prove to us beyond a reasonable doubt that it's safe. I'm very skeptical of certain transhumanist technologies being implemented under capitalism. I think for-profit enterprises could very easily abuse these technologies. But people have always been interfering with nature in sustainable ways, and I don't see any reason why they can't interfere with human nature in sustainable ways under a democratic, anarchist system.
Well, you have raised quite a few important points there. We will probably come back to discussing how we evaluate and deal with risks, such as the precautionary principle. In a moment, I'm going to ask all the panelists to give me the definition and the level of interest in the word anarchism. But I'll point out for everybody who's watching, and we've now got nearly 20 people watching live, that we are going to be driving the discussion from what's in the Q&A part of this Google Hangout system. We already have quite a number of questions in there, so please find it. It should be relatively straightforward if you are watching this from Google+. If you're watching it without having logged in, you'll have the annoying situation of being able to read the questions but not write. So Google Plus requires you to log in with at least one of your accounts, and then you're able to see what the questions have been raised. And there already are, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions. Now, we're not going to get through all of the questions, but we will look at the questions with the most +1 votes. So as you are listening to the answers from the panelists, give most of your attention to what the panelists say, but you can quickly look from time to time at the questions and indicate what you'd like us to discuss. Having said all that, let's go back to Summer. What does anarchism mean to you? And would you describe yourself as an anarchist, and why?
In very simplistic soundbite terms, anarchism is freedom, self-determination, and autonomy. It also goes hand in hand with freedom from violence. Even the schools of anarchism that believe in violence as a necessary political tactic, it's all in the objective of ending the overwhelming violence of contemporary society. So that's, in a nutshell, what anarchism means to me, and I certainly identify as an anarchist, and have for some time, and I study, as a PhD student, historical anarchism around the turn of the 20th century, particularly the Partido Liberal Mexicano, which was an anarchist faction involved in the Mexican Revolution.
We might come back to that later, but to what extent do you think that was a successful example of anarchism?
Oh, it wasn't successful in that it achieved its objective. It was crushed through government violence, government suppression.
Right. And just out of curiosity, what would you point to as the most promising example of anarchism you've seen in terms of changing how groups organize?
I mean, the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish Revolution is generally pointed out as the iconic, more successful example, though that also ended in tragedy and being crushed by both fascist or conservative violence and Stalinist violence. But I don't necessarily see those kind of histories as that important. The principles of anarchism, of decentralization, self-determination, initiative, collaboration, are around us all over the place, both formally and informally, and they've been around in human history for a long time. By most anthropological accounts, humans lived in classless, stateless societies for the majority of our time as a species. So I guess I see that as, I see the tradition as inspiring, but the relative lack of success in the grand revolutions, I guess doesn't mean as much to me, because the grand revolutions of the 20th century that did succeed, in many ways, backfired, such as the various state communist revolutions.
Thanks. Let's move to Waldemar. So we hear there anarchism is about decentralization and improved collaboration. What's your take? And would you describe yourself as pro-anarchist?
As a true anarchist, well, I would say that anarchism for me is a broad term. It's a belief in a fully free and consensual society, and in that a society that is achieved not through legal force or political government, but free agreements, voluntary cooperation on a basis of equality. And that's a broad term. It encompasses a lot of various kinds of anarchists, market anarchists, socialist anarchists, etc., etc. I myself see myself as anarchist somewhere.
What kind of anarchist, sorry?
As a minarchist.
Minarchist. You have to explain what that means.
Very, very small government.
Small government. And what would that small government be doing?
Well, basically you have discussed it, that it's defense, legal system.
Right.
That's a quick definition of it.
Great. Well, let's move to Kris and Dan. The same question to the two of you. What does anarchism mean, and to what extent do you identify with the anarchist traditions?
Anarchism means to me freedom and equality. And to echo Summer, I think that the Spanish Civil War, in the beginning, had an excellent example of what anarchism can be. And in the future, and anarchism also means to me what, even though the Zapatistas don't identify as anarchists, they represent to me a working society that is free of oppression from governments and corporations. So I could talk about more about anarchism in my own personal life if you want, but
yeah, let's hear a little bit about how you're applying anarchism in your own personal life. So, no rules, no rulers. You make your own. Well, tell me more.
Well, I'm obviously a secular anarchist transhumanist, so I don't think that there is a God. But nor do I think, as I said before, we should become gods. So, in my own personal life, I try to make everything as fair as possible. So it's very hard when you live in the United States to have fairness. The technology that we're talking over right now is made in horrendous conditions overseas by children. I have some stats right here, like there's reasons why I'm an anarchist, right? For instance, there's 250 million children ages 5 to 14 who are forced to work in sweatshops. Now, am I going to support that in my own personal life? Absolutely not. But it's a symptom of capitalism and of globalizing neoliberalism. Would you?
Yeah, I think David's definition at the beginning was pretty good. A system without rulers, that goes back to the Greek roots, and without archos rulers. But it's important to note that anarchy means not just freedom from state rule, but also freedom from bosses, freedom from patriarchal rule, freedom from heterosexism, you name it. And I was about 6 months ago or so, I started a website because I was curious. I wanted to ask the question, can anarchy actually work on a large scale, when, in an industrial society, you know, when and how and where. The website's called anarchyinaction.org. And I've collected hundreds of examples of people trying to put anarchy into practice. These are horizontally organized societies, communities, organizations, movements, and rebellions. And I found that in a shocking number of times, it's able to function, it's able to succeed in its goals. And I'll just read you a few examples. Right in revolutionary Spain, you had about 3.2 million residents living in anarchist communities. In the Ukraine, from 1918 to 1921, you had about 7 million people. In El Alto, Bolivia today, you have people implementing partially anarchistic society of 1 million people there. With the Zapatistas in Mexico, depending on who you ask, there's 120,000 to 300,000 people living without a state. And I could talk more about that example because I visited them briefly last year. So for me, I start at looking at the current system we have, capitalism, and I just think that it's pushing humans off of the cliff. This is a system that requires infinite growth on a finite planet, and it's through global warming, through imperialism, through extreme inequality. It's just pushing humans to the brink of extinction. And I could talk more about the dangers of the imperative that the market pushes on different firms, the grow or die imperative. If you don't keep constantly growing, and therefore usually consuming more resources, exploiting the environment more, then you're squeezed out by your competitors. And I just think that for the sake of our survival and for the sake of creating a free society, we have to push very quickly in an anarchistic direction. I don't know that we'll necessarily get there, but it's definitely the vision that I subscribe to.
Well, thanks to everybody for setting the scene very well by these opening remarks. We're now going to look at some of the questions that have been raised, and we're going to start with the one which has the highest number of +1s, because I think it leads on very nicely from what we were just discussing. The question is by Mark Argento, and it's as follows. He says, the lingua franca of pre-transhumanist political thought, that means normal political thought, continues to inhibit dialogue between the camps that have been historically labeled as left and right. And are there plans to bring these camps together rather than still having this big battle between left and right? And it depends what you mean by left and right, but part of the division has been whether people think capitalism is basically a useful and important aspect of society, or whether capitalism is fundamentally flawed in the way that we've just heard Dan speaking about. So the question is, are there reasonable efforts planned to bring these camps together to create a new kind of futurist political dialogue in which we can move beyond some of the language and the limits from the past? So who wants to address some of that hot potato?
Actually, many of the new political debates will be inside the movements that were broadly called left and right, where you will probably see breaks in many of the political orientations. Because the world is changing, institutions are changing, thoughts are changing. And I think, particularly, if you start to bring transhumanism into this discussion, it's important to, sounds bad in English, check your language, to look where you are using words and how you can open up your mind and see where there are similarities on the basis of a shared transhumanist ideology.
So we can move away from some of the old language by recognizing that the left-right distinction between, which has mainly been about economic politics, needs to be complemented by various other dimensions. There's a dimension of cultural politics, which, to be fair, has been around for a long time. There's also a new dimension of approaches to biopolitics, which is whether people think it makes sense to take charge of our biology, or whether we should not be involving ourselves in that. And you're expecting the existing political groups each to be split and to be ripe then for creative new partnerships.
I certainly think so. I was asked to read the manifesto beforehand, and all our listeners can find it on the Google Plus side and read for themselves. And my impression is, of course, that this is, I'm aware that this is not a finished document. It's a work in progress. But it's important, if you start to introduce transhumanist ideas, to start to, well, check the language and also see where there are conflicts with the previous ideology and how it could develop further. Because much of the document, of course, has a signal in order to show that the text is being part of a broad socialist movement with some, well, some underlying that's not part of a more statist, vanguardist socialism. But of course, there are some parts where I think it could have gotten even more interesting. For instance, in the third chapter, I do notice that the concept, the transhumanist concept of morphological freedom, isn't that well developed, because issues regarding bodily freedom in a broad sense there is more used with a traditionalist narrative of how, of capitalism, of neoliberalism, etc. And there it's difficult to find, well, why morphological freedoms could unite, for instance, intergender, trans persons, and transhumanism. It sort of gets lost in a critical queer post-colonial theory, and it's not necessary. I think it's easier to develop a morphological discussion.
What do you mean by?
Yeah, go on.
May I ask him what he means by a morphological discussion when it comes to anarchism mixed with transhumanism?
Morphological freedom. You have the right to your own body and to change it.
Yes, and just to throw this out there, prior to this discussion, I talked with New York City anarcho-primitivists, and they stressed that we talk about opting out of a techno-utopia anarcho-society. And I think that opting out is very important also. So when you say the freedom to enhance yourself, we also need to allow people the freedom to opt out of transhumanism as well.
Well, yes. It's part of the morphological freedom.
So, Waldemar, you're giving maybe a 1 thumbs up or 1.5 thumbs up to the document in terms of saying it's making a good introduction to a discussion it needs to have, and you're just looking forward to more people getting involved in a discussion, helping to perhaps move away from some of the historical ways of discussing things. And
well, you can find parts where you can start to see some questions in a new light. For instance, where there is a section in the manifesto that discusses anarchists, well, forming delegates as mouthpieces for representations, but I don't see a discussion of how technology enhances this basic anarchist model.
so, Summer, what's your view on what you've been hearing? And maybe you want to refer back to the question about left, how important is the discussion between left wing and right wing, and whether we can move away from some of that language?
To some extent, I think the dream of having a universal language or any easy uniting principle or discourse is at best unlikely and at worst dangerous in these times. On the theme of different languages, I'm an academic in the humanities. That's what American Studies is, by and large. It's an interdisciplinary discipline. So interacting with folks from more science and math, computer science-based disciplines, it's always interesting to see how different the language is. And I see that a lot in transhumanism. A lot of people just have no familiarity with the kinds of concept I talk about. But one of the key insights from the broad post-structuralist or postmodernist scholarship is that suspicion of grand narratives and just an emphasis on how fragmented, decentralized things are in the so-called postmodern era. So I really see I see that as the spirit of the age in many ways. Definitely furthered by technology, the internet. You have so many, different subcultures, groups with their own languages, their own histories, logics, frameworks, and I think that's just going to continue. And personally, I find it an encouraging theme. I think the way to work together, to have collaborations, is specifically connecting with those groups, learning other languages, making those connections, and I think it really works out on the community and individual level. And to some extent, I think the language of left and right, while still relevant in many cases, is already at least very simplistic, and already in the broad left community, there's so many other issues, so many other themes that are important, like, of course, state versus non-state, one's perspective on indigenous rights, indigenous sovereignty, decolonization, things like that. So I guess I see a flourishing of lots of different languages and no common language, and I think that's okay.
So, Dan, I'm going to come to you now, but I would also like to feed in one more question from the Q&A. And as I said, I'm going to be prejudiced towards the questions that have got the most +1. So if you are watching this and you would particularly like a question to be addressed by the panel, then get in and +1 it. So the question has nominally got my own name alongside it, but it's actually asked by somebody who said they couldn't take part in the discussion, Harry Webb, so I put it in his behalf. And he's saying, well, how are we actually going to make decisions in this new world? Are we going to still have elected democratic parliaments, which in some sense take decisions on behalf of people? Or can we use technology? Can we use the e-petition system, which is already there? Can we enhance that system? And can we look towards what Harry calls a virtual Athenian direct democracy as a way in which we should be discussing? So I'll give that question first to Dan and Kris.
Sure. Well, I can tell you when I visited the Zapatistas last year, they had assemblies at the local level. And again, these were not technological decisions being made by computer screens. These were decisions being made face-to-face. They elected delegates up to 2 higher levels, the autonomous municipality level and the regional or Caracol level. And I met with the highest level of government there. Even at that highest level of government, people only serve part-time for 15 days out of the month. They have a 2-year term limit, and they are unpaid. So this is an example of how confederations can coordinate the decisions of many local communities. It's interesting that the question brought up Athenian direct democracy, because I see Athenian direct democracy actually as an example of anarchy, not anarchism, but anarchy for at least the 40,000 male citizens. Certainly anarchy was not extended to the women, the slaves, the non-citizens. Now, what computers can do certainly is facilitate the flow of information. And I think that's very important in coordinating the economic affairs, making sure that resources and labor are being allocated to the places where they're needed the most. And actually, the science fiction novel, The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, is a pretty good example of how computers are used through what the fictional anarchist planet of Anares calls the production distribution coordination system, in order to assess what communities need the most, what resources workplaces have available to them, and the computers are essential in making sure that the system runs smoothly and efficiently. Now, of course, it's important to have human checks on this all the time, as the end of the novel, which I won't spoil, but which it really shows.
So we'll capture some of these notes, such as the name of that novel, The Dispossessed, and also you mentioned earlier anarchyinaction.org. We'll put them in the Google Plus page for this, so people can find them easily afterwards. So, Kris.
I propose a more radical approach to implementing anarchism globally. So, to mix anarchism with transhumanism, let's say if every single individual on the planet had sped up consciousness, a sped up mind, And that's another thing that I would like to talk about is the speed at which consciousness functions. But because you can't have all these voices in your head and vote every single minute. However, as we become cyborgs, we will be able to be connected to a globalized, interconnected system of brain-to-computer interfaces. And via that system, we can vote very much like anarchists interpret voting, not for representatives, but on concepts and ideas.
So are you saying that the chances for improving how we take decisions are going to be held up until we've got this sped up minds? Can we make significant progress for the time being, or do we have to wait for biology and artificial intelligence to make these leaps?
No, I was just making a prediction about the future. For the here and now, I see nonviolent direct action. And in some cases, just pure direct action to overthrow capitalism and the tyranny of the government. So, for instance, let's say we have the wall in Palestine. It needs to come down, right? It just needs to come down. So, how would we today make sure that wall never goes up again? First off, how do we destroy the wall? Second, how do we make sure it doesn't go back up? And Dan and I were talking about this the other day. We feel that in the here and now, we can have, if we decided to, via computer chat rooms and other ways of communicating worldwide, have people fly over to Palestine and work with the Palestinians to knock down that wall using the technology that we have right now. And then once you knock down that wall and it's built again, the same thing happens again. We knock it down and they build it, but I think that if the UN is against the wall, every single anarchist I know is against the wall. I think the consensus around the world is that it's pretty much called the apartheid wall, and I think that there's a consensus around the wall, around the world, that wall has to come down.
If I could interject, the Palestine Solidarity Movement is a great example of technology being used to amplify the decisions of local communities. So what you had, I think in 2005 or 6, was the boycott, divest, sanctions call, which was endorsed by a near consensus of Palestinian unions, political parties, civil organizations, which opposed the wall, among other things. This manifesto got put out through the internet around the world, and today the Palestine Solidarity Movement is one of the largest, most militant and vibrant movements in the world. And we have people such as the International Solidarity Movement and Anarchists Against the Wall in Palestine, Israel, doing the very things Kris was talking about, blockading the construction of the wall.
And also ICAD, the Israeli Commission Against House Demolitions. Because as they build a wall, they destroy houses.
I'm going to bring in Waldemar here, and although there's quite a few topics that's in play in the discussion, I want to feed in a question from Sally Morem, because this has been touched on a few minutes ago. And Sally's question is, some anarchists, and we've heard it in this call, have expressed sharp criticisms of capitalism. But Sally points out that capitalism has proven itself a system capable of encouraging free and uncoerced cooperation between enormous numbers of people. How do you square these two observations? So, Waldemar, in your minarchism, where do you stand about supporting or competing against capitalism? And feel free to comment on the other points you've just heard as well.
Well, the problem with not talking about capitalism is that it's actually very diverse system where you have to start to be careful with words if you believe in free markets or in capitalism. There was a famous saying that as a free marketeer, you believe in people, not Walmart minus the state. And when I listen to how you can organize economics stateless and leaderless, I have come to think about the sharing economy. And in the media, it has been mainly discussed as the startups like Uber, Airbnb, but actually it's a much broader phenomenon between, well, helping people to cooperate, to share resources through technology, which is part of a free market, a voluntarist association, voluntary cooperation. And I think there is much for transhumanism to explore in the sharing economy, in the sharing of technological resources that is being formed in quite different fashion by changing technologies. For instance, the most important part of the Bitcoin is not the Bitcoin per se, but its blockchain and how you can use various parts of cryptography in order to facilitate communication and sharing.
So, Waldemar, to summarize, you're saying that capitalism is a broad field of different things. It's just like socialism is a broad field, and it's misleading to address capitalism as a single entity and say there are some problems in it, therefore it's all needs opposition. On the contrary, there are some elements you feel should be preserved in the world that you look forward to.
If I was writing a similar manifesto as the one you can find on the Google Plus page, I would probably start with something similar as when they talked about the problem with vanguardism in socialism and how it relates to, well, anarchist socialism, but from the other side of the previous political spectrum.
Summer, what's your view on this question?
Well, first, the fundamental problem when talking about capitalism as encouraging free and uncoerced cooperation is that of property rights, particularly bourgeois property rights, or the rights over the means of production, that individuals control means of production like factories and so on, and that's enforced at the point of a gun, either by the state or by private contractors. So within that context, it's difficult to see capitalism as at least primarily operating through free and uncoerced cooperation. It's certainly cooperation, and there are a lot of things about capitalism in that sense that I definitely like, but the basis for the system is either state violence and protection of property or non-state violence and protection of property, and that's one of the reasons that I consider myself an anarchist communist. I have perhaps more sympathy than Kris for market anarchism and various forms of individualist anarchism. I'd say the anarchist figure that inspires me the most is Waldemar Ingdhahl, who kind of walked the line between the individualist and collectivist anarchist traditions at the time.
Just say, for people who don't know about him, just say a little bit more about what time he lived and where he was.
Oh, Waldemar Ingdhahl. So she was an anarchist born in the late 19th century, died in the early 20th century. Was a strident, well, what we'd call now a strident feminist, and supported all different kinds of anarchist movements. It initially involved very much in the individualist anarchist movement of that time with Benjamin Tucker and so on. Then became an anarchist without adjectives, and at the end of her life was supporting the Partido Liberal Mexicano, that anarchist faction of the Mexican Revolution, and considered the Mexican Revolution inspiring. So as I said, I have more sympathy for markets than maybe some people do, than maybe Kris and some other people who identify as communists do. It's personally not my aesthetics. I like, I guess, free sharing, or at least, if there must be an accounting system, I'd like to see it based on actual resources, physical resources, rather than currency, which just seems to me a way for people to gain advantage over others and leads to unequal distributions. But I'd say the fundamental problem of reconciling capitalism with anarchism is that of property, and how you can have especially bourgeois property without violence.
So Kris and Dan.
Summer, I agree with you, actually. I think my biggest influence in anarchism was actually Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex and The Ethics of Ambiguity. She was born in 1908 and died in 1986, and was partners with Sartre. And the individualist anarchism that she articulated at the end of her life is very important to me, because she was a Marxist for her entire life. And in the 1960s, when Sartre and Simone saw what the government was doing to the kids who were protesting the Vietnam War, they actually ended up being anarchists. And from an existentialist point of view, it's fundamentally about the individual, and then the individual becoming part of a community. David,
anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with basically what Summer and Kris have been saying. I find the idea that capitalism encourages free, uncoerced cooperation rather absurd. If you look at the history and the practice of capitalism, it's an extremely violent system of imposing private property and wage labor on people. You know, you see the eviction of peasants from commonly managed land. You see the enslavement of Africans, the genocide of indigenous peoples, witch hunts used to discipline women, and constant interference in the market, whether it's bailouts of banks or wars for oil. So it's not a free system. I think it's important to talk, to explain exactly what it is, what we mean by capitalism. And for me, it's definitely distinct from markets. I see capitalism as a system characterized by private property, by wage labor. But I can certainly envision, as Kris and Summer have said, a market socialist economy that actually would be based on free and uncoerced cooperation. It wouldn't be my preference, but I would see it as consistent with anarchism, unlike capitalism.
Waldemar, have you anything to add to that discussion about markets may work without many of the elements of capitalism?
If markets may work without capitalism, well, as I said, it depends on what we discuss as capitalism. I think it's important for the discussion to use more of a market anarchist definition, because it's easier to see where technology, where societal changes could change. Well, market exchange and not economic privilege, because it broadens the debate in and between anarchists when it comes to transhumanism.
Okay, let's move on to the question by Stuart Dambrot, which is one of the ones with the highest number of votes. This is talking about the emergence of a technocratic elite. So is this something that worries us or not? I'll read out the question. Regarding the manifesto, there's a bullet in it that says leaders, gurus, and political figures should be carefully criticized by experts to see that bottom-up organizing remains a reality. This implies the possibility of an emergent technocratic elite. Should this concern us? Where do people stand on elites, technocratic elites or otherwise?
it seems a bit strange that they should be criticized by experts or a scientific community, because it's important to be critical of experts and also of the scientific community. Particularly having a critical debate about science is important to strengthen science.
Yes, but right now, the people who own the means of production are capitalists.
Yes?
I find it useful to distinguish between having authority and being authority. This is a distinction made by an anarchist FAQ, which is referenced at the top of the Transhumanist Anarchist Manifesto. So you can be an authority, meaning you're an expert. People consult you about technological matters. That doesn't mean you have authority. You're not making decisions for other people. So it's very possible to have, it's necessary, in fact, in an industrial society, and especially in a transhumanist society, to have experts to know what they're doing that don't become a technocratic class making decisions for other people.
There is certainly danger of it if you don't have a free debate. And I think it's particularly important if you're promoting a more free society.
It's the reality of today, in the here and now, that the people who own the means of production to create the transhumanist technology in which we are talking about are capitalists. Now, so that means a few people own the means of production instead of the means of production being owned by the people.
Right. I mean, what was it that I read the other day, that 85 people, the richest 85 people in the world, own as much wealth as the bottom 50%, and of course that that obscures scientific research. That obscures what technology is used for. Of course, capitalism interferes with science.
I think the important part, of course, we could have a discussion about the role of capitalism but to put the debate forward, I think it's important in seeing of liberating technologies and how they can be used. The interesting part of many of these technological trends that we're seeing today is that they often favor the common man and put more power, more abilities in their hands. And how do you see that these technologies are designed to further enhance their possibilities?
So that feeds into what John Smith has asked in his question. He says that there are particular technologies which are going to accelerate democracy, such as the emerging energy internet, where more people can source energy locally, the Internet of Things, and the transport internet. Could these emerging systems be the technological foundations for an anarchist society? This has also been covered in the recent book by the futurist, whose name I'll remember in a minute, who talks about the emergence of a collaborative commons. So, I mean, Waldemar, you are saying that there is...
Of course, the opportunities that are given, for instance, by 3D printing, that we see some promise in them. And I think it's important to see how these technologies are kept, well, in order to give more power and more opportunities for people in general using them. And we see, of course, a very interesting development from an anarchist point of view should be the free software and open software movements.
I want to come back to the comment that Dan made at the beginning. He says that there are dangers to technology as well, especially when technology is being developed by large companies who may often have their own financial motives to pursue it. And I guess Dan has in mind things like genetically modified foods, which may be introduced to boost the profits of a number of companies, or the risks of the oil industry, which is leading, many people will say, to too much greenhouse gases. And there's also the risk that some companies will rush headlong into the development of very clever artificial intelligence systems and then regret what's been done, because these artificial intelligence systems won't have all the checks and balances. And they might have autonomous drones doing bad things, financial systems and military systems, or even worse. So do the other panelists share that concern that Dan raised, that if we just let the financial motivation take a priority, then technology may lead to things that we deeply regret afterwards? Maybe you want to comment on that?
Well, I see technology. I'm a techno-optimist, but I also see the reality of today, as you were just talking about. The people who have control over the technology need to step back and allow a cooperative community to have control over that technology. Like, I'd also like to point out that it's not just capitalism, it's also politics. As Martin Rees talks about, he's very pessimistic about politics. Well, I wonder if, and this is why in the document the Fermi paradox is mentioned, I wonder if a civilization has ever really tried out anarchism on their entire planet, and instead, like the hierarchical structures lead to such violence and such oppression that is that what happened on every single planet that had intelligent life? I don't know. And so what I'm trying to throw out there is, let's try anarchism. Now, for Martin Rees, I want to know, what he would say about anarchism. Is anarchism the answer to possibly the survival of an entire species?
So my question for you is going to be, you say that there are obstacles to anarchism. There are companies which want to continue exerting their power, naturally, for their own profits, and there are also politicians who want to hold on to power too. So, I mean, how is the transition to this kind of a deeper collaboration going to take place? Is it something to be done by some kind of a struggle, or is it something to be achieved by a more gentle evolution of ideas, spreading ideas and seeing a gradual transformation?
Summer, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I would say that it's got to be both. I mean, the struggle against oppression, against domination of all different kinds, whether it's queer bashing or economic inequality, poverty, just getting by. It's an everyday struggle for I don't know, for lots of folks, anyways. And it goes hand in hand with spreading of ideas. Obviously, the state and capital are not going to disappear overnight. Even in the most optimistic scenario, it's a very, very gradual process. And as the novel The Dispossessed, which was mentioned earlier, shows, that the revolution really never ends, particularly if you are against hierarchy, domination in principle. That's something that's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing analysis you have to make of how is this system working, how are these social interactions working, because as I'm sure we've all seen at everyday levels, there are different social groups get dominated by one or a small number of people. There are always power dynamics to think about, and none of that's magically going to go away. So I'd say it's both.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would agree it's both. I take a lot of inspiration from the line from the Industrial Workers of the World Manifesto, which says that we're trying to build the new world within the shell of the old. We're creating spaces of autonomy and anarchy. The region of Rojava in the Syrian portion of Kurdistan right now is a great example of people putting into practice direct democratic assemblies, educating people, running their defense democratically, and in some cases really holding their ground in some fierce and heroic battles against ISIS. The Zapatistas, who we've mentioned a few times, another example, they've been running their own communities for 21 years now since they rose up on January 1st, 1994. They haven't taken any money from the Mexican government since, I believe, 1996, and yet they're running autonomously their own schools, their own health care, their own government system and community institutions. And yes, sometimes these anarchistic and anti-authoritarian spaces need to be defended violently. But as the Zapatistas have shown, you can really minimize violence by appealing to solidarity from people around the world, by really shining a light on the atrocities of in their case, the Mexican government, and using the global pressure in order to make violence less necessary.
So if people are listening to this and they're skeptical that anarchism can ever work, you would urge them to look at the potential that we can see from the Zapatista movement in Mexico. Even though things haven't gone completely as smoothly as they might have hoped, they are still holding on to many of their principles after more than a decade of self-government.
Absolutely, they've introduced not only in their words quite a bit of dignity and freedom into their lives, but they've also materially improved their conditions. So I've heard from many different people when I was there that actually the Zapatista autonomous-run hospitals are better than the state-run hospitals in the surrounding indigenous villages that did not choose to join the Zapatista revolution. So there have been examples of the state hospitals actually referring people to the Zapatista hospitals, which have ultrasound machines and other pretty essential devices that the state-run hospitals haven't been able to develop.
So we've been talking now for more than an hour. I think we need to wind the discussion up because it's quite a long time for people to listen to. I'm going to ask each of you to make a closing statement, and in the closing statement you can say whatever you think needs to be in people's minds, and you can refer briefly to any of the questions that haven't yet been answered. And the question which is top of the list that hasn't been answered yet is by Sally Morem, who comes to a core question which we've been touching on several times, which is, how will politics handle the emergence of a new society based on accelerating technology, and then an even newer society as the technology continues to advance, and yet newer and newer societies? And are we really going to be able to change our politics as technology changes so quickly? So that's one thing you can answer. So let's take them in the order. So Summer, Kris, Dan, and then Waldemar. Your closing remarks on anything you think is the most important for viewers to take away from this discussion.
Yeah, I think one point that we touched on earlier that we didn't necessarily go into detail is about anarchism in relation to science and the scientific establishment and the rate of innovation. I think one of the really interesting things about anarchism is the argument that the current systems, the current established hierarchies, both through economic inequality, but also just through barriers to entry, the way institutions of learning, the means of education are so protected and guarded, such as the fees you have to pay for journal access, things like that, that all these different barriers to entry and hierarchies are, or at least quite possibly, greatly reducing the rate of acceleration. This is an argument in particular I've seen from William Gillis, a market anarchist and transhumanist, and I think there's a lot of potential there, and that's something that's worthwhile considering in relation to transhumanism, because anarchism is about opposing all hierarchies and challenging all those I guess territorial claims that you're not allowed to be involved in this. So I think there's a lot of possibility for more egalitarian, economically egalitarian society that challenges all those established hierarchies and I think we could potentially see much more impressive innovation.
So another way to describe some of that is to use the language of market failures, that sometimes the existing companies have done very well out of previous technology, gain some monopoly power, and then use it to compete and fight against new ways in which technology might improve lives, but do it in a way that would take market power away from the current monopolists. I think people from both sides of the political spectrum can view that. So indeed, innovation sometimes suffers because of the operation of powers that need to be challenged. Closing remarks from Kris and Dan?
All right. Well, I see a question here. How does AGI fit in with anarchism? And that's actually part of my closing remarks.
This is a question from Peter Morgan. Yeah.
I think that the scientific community needs to immediately stop testing on the animals. And I also think that artificial intelligence labs should be very careful with their algorithms, because those algorithms may produce elements of consciousness which experience fear, anxiety, depression, and when you have elements of consciousness, you don't know exactly what it's experiencing. So we need to be very careful about how we create an artificial intelligence consciousness, because I also urge consciousness studies people and philosophers of mind and neuroscientists to really do a lot of research into the speed of consciousness and the speed of qualia, let's say, the speed at which people can interpret different concepts. Because we have brains that evolved over millions of years. And I don't know, and I'm skeptical that a artificial intelligence is going to be better or faster than the human brain. I mean, in something like that small of a human brain is over 40 miles of neural connections. That's absolutely amazing. So, will artificial intelligence really help us that much? Or did evolution already figure out a very fast way of thinking? Now, that also brings up genetic engineering. We should probably look into genetically engineering the human brain and enhance it so that we can speed up our own cognition. We should look into enhancing drugs and all these. When I say enhancement, and once we become cyborgs, we will be able to vote on consensus level democracy and direct democracy, because potentially we'll have a very sped up cognition. So we won't need an AI god, like the singularitarians try to point out. But
I would add to that I would hope that the new technology will not just make us think faster, but it will be able to counter some of our primitive, primeval characteristics towards short-sightedness and egocentrism and cognitive biases, and that the technology will make us wiser and kinder and more collaborative rather than just smarter. But I share with you that I have high hopes for what new technology can do.
I absolutely agree with you. However, we do have the question of human nature. Is there human nature in the first place?
Well, I think as transhumanists we can say there is human nature and we can change it. But let's leave that for another discussion. Let's take closing comments from Dan. What do you think about all this technology that you've been hearing about in the last 5 minutes? What are the closing comments that you'd like people to take away?
Well, I think on the one hand, technology has an extremely liberatory potential. Waldemar brought up 3D printers earlier, and this is a way to really save labor around the world. You bring these to very rural areas and allow them to industrialize if they choose to in a truly autonomous way without being reliant on multinational corporations. New forms of energy, renewable wind and solar energy and water-based energy really allow people to decentralize and take community control and ownership over how energy is produced. Free and open source software and also just open source knowledge in general is extremely exciting to me. The idea that we can introduce new technologies, new medicines without companies holding them hostage with patents and copyrights. I think that can be extremely liberatory. On the other hand, I'm very wary of what we in the climate justice movement call techno-fixes. The idea that we can just solve global warming, for example, by injecting toxic chemicals in the ground in order to extract more methane gas, or splitting atoms in order to turn a turbine and relying therefore on nuclear power, or blowing up mountains to get so-called clean coal, and I could go on. As far as interfering with human nature, again, I'm skeptical of even talking about this within capitalism. The idea that corporations could own patents or on human or non-human life, can turn these things into commodities, seems very dangerous to me. But I basically agree with what Murray Bookchin said. He was an anarchist. He was actually citing someone else named Charles Elton. He said, we're going to interfere with nature, and I would extend this to human nature. But if we're going to do so, we shouldn't be interfering like people playing chess, moving pieces on the board. Rather, we should interfere like a captain does on a ship, from the ground up. And that's I guess, the kind of approach I'd like to see as we possibly enter a transhuman world.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for that, especially having recently been reading the book by Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. If people are at all interested, I would strongly recommend that book, and she has an excellent chapter on geoengineering, when indeed she talks about the problems of techno-fixes. And I do believe that technology can help to solve these problems via, amongst other things, enhanced renewable energy and potentially removing carbon from the atmosphere. But these other issues, if we try and proceed, I mean, that's a great analogy. If we try and proceed like chess players, we may find that we are outthought by nature, which is more complicated than we supposed. But if we can work with nature in an intelligent way as a captain, then possibly there is opportunity. So Naomi Klein talks about we should work from the earth up rather than from the sky down, as I remember. Let's move finally to Waldemar as to your closing comments that you'd like people to take away. If there's any reactions to what you've heard in the last 10 minutes or any other final comments.
Oh, I want to post a link on the Google Plus page, a book that I enjoyed reading, namely Markets, Not Capitalism, edited by Charger and Johnson, and I think it will give the listeners quite many of the points I've been discussing. Yes.
Markets, Not Capitalism.
Yes. And I think it's interesting to take home the idea that there are many new ways to solve the coordination problems. For instance, we haven't delved into existential risk here today, even if it was a part of the manifesto. And I think there are new ways of tackling that problem through distributed systems, through the use of big data. And I think there is a lot to take away from that one too. But basically, change starts at home, namely that many of these technologies, such as 3D printing, using open software, etc., are something that you can use in everyday life, in your everyday life. And I think a good way to start using them well is to start using them yourself.
Absolutely. So we can get our own experiences of these technologies. So we speak more wisely rather than just some theoretical idea. I'm afraid we are out of time, but there's a couple of follow-ups that I'm going to encourage people. First of all, the document on the Anarchist Transhumanist Manifesto is certainly a work in progress, and people are very welcome to get in touch with the authors of that. It's a Google document, and the scope for people to suggest changes, and even possibilities for people to create their own documents as variants of that to make the discussion flow. And in that ongoing discussion, there are a couple of places that people can look. First of all, you can look on the Google Plus event page for this present meeting, where people are posting links, or will be posting links. For example, the site that Dan mentioned, which is anarchyinaction.org. Many others.
There are instructions on the site if you'd like to become a contributor. Regardless of whether or not you agree with anarchism, I'd welcome people's input and contributions.
So more people can get involved in that. And the questions which we haven't had a chance to look at, they are still preserved in the Hangout. So if you go back into the Hangout, you can see the questions that have been answered. You can also see the questions that haven't been answered. And some of these, I think, are very interesting questions indeed, which will spark other discussions in the future. And then the last point I'd like to briefly talk about is we've had today's meeting on the case for anarchist transhumanism. This is just one aspect of the discussion about anticipating tomorrow's politics. This time next week, we are going to have a separate panel on better political decision-making via better technology, in which we're going to look at things like online voting, responsive democracy, and more. We've got a couple of panelists already confirmed. You can see their names there, Andreas Kasparavicius and David Orban, and possibly we can have another one or two panelists. If you are strongly interested in taking part in that, then please get in touch. We have ideas for a follow-up week as well. And more than that, we are going to produce a book of articles very soon. We have already had submissions for, I think, 12 chapters to be included in this book, which is going to be published in March. So if you think you would like to get involved in this discussion about anticipating tomorrow's politics, I do encourage it, because I think that the contemporary political discussion is too stuck in the present and is not sufficiently aware of the radical changes that we should be grasping. So thanks to all the panelists are taking part.
Something?
Yes,
right,
please.
Okay. There are no leaders in anarchism. And the Anarchist Transhumanist Manifesto, if someone wants to start other manifestos, that is very welcomed. But there are there's no defined leadership in an anarchist society. And so I encourage everyone who is listening to this to come up with their own ideas and to contribute any way they can to how anarchism can be mixed with transhumanism.
Well, that's a great point to finish with. So I want to thank everybody for taking part, and I look forward to understanding this whole field better. I confess personally I've been a bit out of my comfort zone in this discussion. It's not an area that I feel completely at home in, but it is an area that I believe does deserve our attention. So I'm very grateful for everybody for getting involved. Look forward to seeing you again in future discussions. Goodbye.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.